My name is Lillian, and I'm 44 years old. I never imagined my only son would one day become the source of my deepest heartbreak. For most of my life, Daniel was my reason for breathing. I raised him alone after his father, Mark, decided he wasn't ready for fatherhood and walked out when Daniel was just 3 years old. Back then, I promised myself I'd give my boy everything I possibly could, even if it meant sacrificing every piece of myself along the way. We lived in a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, faded wallpaper, and a leaky roof that I patched myself every winter. But it was home, and Daniel never went hungry, never went without love. I worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at night. Every birthday, every school project, every scraped knee, I was there. I thought that meant something. I thought it would build a bond that couldn't be broken. When Daniel turned 18 and left for college, I cried for days, not because I didn't want him to go, but because I was proud. I told everyone my son was going to be someone important. Maybe a doctor or an engineer. I didn't care what he became, as long as he was kind. At first, he called often. Every Sunday evening, we'd talk for an hour about classes, friends, and his dreams. He'd say, "Mom, when I get a good job, you'll never have to work again." Those words were the warmth that carried me through long, cold nights. But somewhere after graduation, those calls became shorter, rushed. He'd say, "Sorry, Mom, I'm busy," and hang up before I could tell him I loved him. When he got a job offer overseas, I was thrilled. It felt like the world was opening up for him. He told me he'd send for me one day, that I'd finally get to see the places I'd only read about. But as time went on, I realized that dream was one-sided. At first, he'd message me photos of his new life, fancy dinners, city views, expensive suits. Then the photos stopped. When I called, he'd sound distracted, impatient. I could hear people laughing in the background, and he'd whisper, "Can I call you later, Mom?" But later never came. I began to sense something deeper, shame, maybe. He didn't want me to see where he lived, how he lived. He didn't want his co-workers or his new girlfriend to know his mother was a middle-aged cleaning lady with calloused hands and wrinkles she couldn't hide. One day, I mentioned missing him, and he snapped. He said, "Mom, you're guilt-tripping me. I'm busy building a life. You should try to do the same." I laughed it off on the phone, but when I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and cried until my pillow was soaked. I never told anyone, not even my friend Ruth from down the street. I didn't want anyone to know my son had started to treat me like a burden. When I fell ill, a flu that turned into pneumonia, I spent weeks recovering alone. I texted Daniel, told him I was sick, hoping he'd call. Instead, he sent a short message. "Take care, Mom. Sending money soon." And he did. The money came. But his voice didn't. I told myself that was enough. That he was doing his best. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We make excuses for our children's cruelty, believing they don't mean it. We tell ourselves they'll come around. That love doesn't just vanish. But deep down, I could feel it, something had changed. The boy who once cried when I dropped him off at school now couldn't stand to hear my voice for 5 minutes. I prayed for him every night, asking God to bring him back to me, even if just in spirit. The house felt emptier each day, like it was holding its breath for someone who would never return. Still, I kept his room clean, his trophies dusted, his photos framed. I even cooked his favorite meal once a week, chicken stew with thyme, just in case he showed up one day, hungry and sorry. But the days turned into months, the months into years. I sent him messages on holidays, birthdays, Mother's Day. Most went unanswered. Sometimes I'd see him post photos online, laughing with friends, traveling to places I could only dream of. He looked happy, he looked free, and I was proud, even if I wasn't part of that happiness. But pride can't fill the silence of an empty house. It can't warm a bed that's grown cold from loneliness. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I sat at the window and whispered to myself, "You raised him well, he'll come back." But part of me no longer believed it. It's strange how motherhood can feel like both a blessing and a curse, how the same love that gives you purpose can also destroy you when it's not returned. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. A choice, a heartbreak, a betrayal I would never fully recover from. Because the day Daniel stopped answering altogether, I knew something inside our bond had shattered for good. When Daniel finally invited me overseas to visit him, I thought it was our chance to heal. After years of distance, that single phone call from him felt like sunlight breaking through clouds I thought would never part. He said he missed me, that he wanted me to see his new home and meet his girlfriend. I remember crying quietly after the call, clutching my phone to my chest. It felt like a piece of my heart was returning. I spent months preparing for the trip. I sold a few old pieces of furniture, saved every penny from my cleaning jobs, and even took on extra shifts to afford the plane ticket. Ruth helped me choose clothes that would make a good impression. She said, "Show them how strong and classy you've become, Lillian." I smiled, pretending not to be nervous. But inside, I was terrified. I hadn't been on a plane in my entire life. The day I left, I wore my nicest dress and carried a suitcase that had seen better days. The flight was long and uncomfortable, but I didn't care. Every hour that passed brought me closer to Daniel. When I finally stepped out of the airport, the city lights were blinding, the air sharp and different. Daniel waved at me from across the crowd, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look like a stranger. I ran to him, hugging him tightly, but he hesitated before returning it. His cologne smelled expensive, sterile, nothing like the boy I'd raised. "You look different, Mom," he said with a forced smile. "Good different," I laughed it off, though his eyes darted around nervously, as if worried someone might see us. His apartment was beautiful glass walls, minimalist furniture, everything white and polished. I tried not to stare, but it felt more like a showroom than a home. "You've done well for yourself," I said softly. He shrugged. "It's decent. Clara decorated most of it." When Clara came out to greet me, my stomach tightened. She was stunning, tall, elegant, with perfect makeup and a kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Hale," she said in a tone that sounded rehearsed. "Daniel's told me so much." I thanked her, but I could feel the distance in her voice. She didn't want me there. I could tell from the way she subtly avoided looking directly at me, from the way Daniel stood closer to her than to me. Dinner that night was polite but strained. Clara talked about art galleries and travel. I talked about my garden and old recipes. She nodded as if tolerating a noise she couldn't turn off. Daniel stayed quiet, glancing at her before responding to me, as if needing her approval before speaking. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to them whispering in the other room. My name came up once, followed by a long silence. The next morning, Clara suggested that I explore the city while they were at work. She handed me a brochure and said she'd booked me a bus tour. Her smile was perfect, but her eyes were sharp, cold. I spent the day walking through streets filled with strangers, the air thick with smells I didn't recognize. Everything was beautiful, yet I'd never felt so invisible. When I returned that evening, the apartment was locked. I waited for nearly 2 hours before Daniel finally arrived, apologizing and saying they'd gone to dinner with colleagues. I told him it was fine, but the lump in my throat said otherwise. Days turned into weeks, and each morning Clara grew colder. She began dropping hints that Daniel was so busy and needed focus. One afternoon she took me aside and said, "Lillian, maybe you'd be more comfortable taking an extended vacation while Daniel works things out. You deserve a break." I didn't understand what she meant until Daniel came home later that night with a travel brochure. "Mom," he said carefully, "I thought it might be nice for you to spend some time exploring on your own, maybe a few months somewhere warm. I'll cover everything." My heart sank. "You mean, you don't want me to stay here?" He avoided my eyes. "It's just temporary. Clara thinks it'll help us balance things better. Please understand." I smiled weakly and nodded, pretending I wasn't breaking inside. I didn't want to make him feel guilty. He had his own life now. Maybe I really was in the way. The next week, he bought me a one-way ticket to a small coastal country nearby. "You'll love it there," he said, hugging me quickly at the airport. "I'll visit soon." I tried to believe him. I wanted to believe him. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the glowing city below, telling myself this wasn't the end, that my son just needed space. But something deep in my chest whispered otherwise. When Daniel bought me that one-way ticket to stay overseas longer, I didn't yet see it as abandonment, but I would soon learn. I thought I was visiting my son, but I ended up stranded, and in a place where I knew no one. The first few days after Daniel sent me off felt like a dream I was trying to convince myself was reality. I arrived in a small coastal town, its streets lined with whitewashed houses and markets that smelled of salt and spices. The hotel room Daniel had booked was modest but comfortable. He had paid for 3 weeks, promising to send more funds when it was time to extend my stay. I believed him because I had to. He was my son. Each morning, I'd wake up and look out at the ocean, pretending I was on a long-awaited vacation. I sent Daniel photos of the beach, writing things like, "It's beautiful here. Wish you were with me." He responded with short messages. "Looks great, Mom," or "Glad you're enjoying it." But soon, those messages stopped coming too. I tried to stay hopeful, telling myself he must be busy, that work was taking all his time. When the hotel manager informed me that my stay was ending and no additional payment had been made, I panicked. I messaged Daniel immediately, no reply. I called his number, went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day, and the day after that, until my calls were blocked altogether. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. He had truly left me there, alone, with nowhere to go. My money ran out quickly. I found myself sitting in a cafe one morning, counting the few coins I had left. The owner, a kind older woman named Pilar, noticed my trembling hands and offered me a cup of tea on the house. When she asked where I was from, I couldn't answer without tears filling my eyes. I told her my son was supposed to help me, but he hadn't sent word in weeks. She listened quietly, her gaze heavy with pity. "You are a strong woman," she said finally. "You survive." Pilar introduced me to a local couple who owned a small guest house and needed help cleaning rooms. It wasn't much, but it kept me busy and gave me a bed to sleep in after the hotel stay ended. Each day, I scrubbed floors, changed sheets, and smiled at tourists who didn't know that my heart was slowly collapsing inside me. Every evening, I'd return to my small rented room, pull out the photo of Daniel as a boy missing front teeth, bright eyes, arms around my neck, and whisper, "What happened to you?" I wrote letters I'd never send. Letters filled with anger, sorrow, confusion. Sometimes, I'd tear them up before finishing. Other nights, I'd hide them under my pillow, as if Daniel might one day come searching for them. Months passed. My hair began to gray faster. My back ached more. But I kept working. The locals started calling me La Madre Solitaria, the lonely mother. It fit. I tried not to let bitterness take root, but loneliness is like a weed, it grows no matter how often you cut it down. I prayed every night for some sign, some word from Daniel. Nothing came. The few friends I'd had back home slowly drifted away too. I couldn't blame them. I hadn't told anyone the truth about what happened. Shame is a heavy thing, it silences you. One evening, while cleaning one of the guest rooms, I overheard 2 travelers talking about their families back home. They spoke about love and frustration, about mothers who still called too often. One of them laughed and said, "I'd be lost without my mom." That sentence felt like a blade twisting in my chest. I left the room early and walked to the beach. The waves roared against the shore, wild and uncaring. I screamed into the wind, hoping somehow Daniel could hear me across the ocean. "Why did you leave me?" I shouted until my voice was hoarse. No answer came. Just the endless rhythm of the sea. I began to age in ways that had nothing to do with years. My reflection became foreign to me, sun-browned skin, tired eyes, hands rougher than ever. Yet somehow, I kept going. Pilar often told me, "You have survivor's spirit." But inside I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a discarded thing, a chapter Daniel had torn out and forgotten. Then one afternoon, as I was buying vegetables at the market, a man I'd never seen before approached me. He looked hesitant, holding a folded piece of paper. "Are you Lillian Hale?" he asked in a thick accent. My heart skipped. I nodded. He handed me the note and said softly, "From your home." Someone asked me to give you this. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a letter written in familiar handwriting, my neighbor Ruth's. She had somehow tracked me down through a mutual acquaintance. The words were messy, hurried, but each one hit me like a hammer. Lillian, it read. I don't know what's going on, but someone's living in your house. It's Daniel and a woman. They told everyone you decided to stay overseas for good. I dropped the paper, my vision blurring. People around me kept walking, unaware that my entire world had just shattered again. I picked it up, clutching it to my chest as if it were a lifeline. My home, my son, my life gone. My knees nearly gave out. I stumbled to a bench and sat there until sunset, the letter trembling in my hand. My heart refused to believe it, but deep down, I knew Ruth wouldn't lie. Daniel hadn't just abandoned me. He had replaced me. Then one day, a stranger approached me at the market with a shocking message from home. Someone's living in your house, the message said, and it felt like a dagger through my chest. I read Ruth's words again and again, hoping I had misunderstood them. Maybe she meant someone had rented it, or maybe Daniel was just fixing it up while I was gone. But the more I read, the more the truth bled through every line. Daniel hadn't just left me overseas. He had moved back home with Clara and taken over my life as if I had vanished. The days after that letter were a blur. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I sat by the small window in my rented room, staring out at the sea that now felt like a barrier instead of a view. I kept replaying every memory I had of Daniel, his first steps, his laughter, the promises he made before leaving. How could the same boy who once cried when I was sick now erase me completely from his world? Pilar noticed my silence and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. The shame was unbearable. To be abandoned was one thing, but to be replaced, to have your very existence denied, that was a pain I didn't have words for. A few days later, I gathered the courage to write back to Ruth. My hands shook as I asked her to tell me everything she knew. When her reply came, it confirmed my worst fears. Daniel had returned a few months earlier. He and Clara had told everyone that I was happy overseas and had decided to stay permanently. They even hosted a small gathering to celebrate their new chapter in my home. Ruth said she'd gone to see them once, hoping to talk, but Daniel told her I didn't want to be disturbed. He had even replaced my photos with new ones, him and Clara smiling in front of my garden. The thought of it made me sick. I pressed the letter to my chest and sobbed until I could barely breathe. How could a child forget the mother who gave him everything? I tried calling him again, though I knew he'd blocked me. Still, I left voice messages, my voice breaking as I said, Daniel, it's Mom. Please tell me what's happening. Please. No reply ever came. I felt invisible, like I had died. And no one had bothered to bury me. The people I worked for noticed I wasn't myself. They offered me extra rest days, thinking I was just tired. I wasn't tired, I was hollow. I stopped going to the beach, stopped cooking, stopped caring. My life became a pattern of mechanical movements. Eat, work, sleep, cry, repeat. At night, I'd dream of walking through my old house. In the dream, everything looked the same, but when I tried to enter, Clara stood at the door smiling. She'd say, "You don't live here anymore." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing. Sometimes I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then, one morning, Ruth's final letter arrived. It was short, only a few lines. Lillian, she wrote, I'm so sorry. They've changed everything. Your furniture is gone. Your name is no longer on the mailbox. They tell people you moved on. But I know the truth, you would never leave like that. I pressed the paper to my lips, whispering her name like a prayer. She was right. I would never leave like that. The realization hit me like lightning. Daniel and Clara had planned this. The vacation, the one-way ticket, the sudden silence, it was all part of their plan. They wanted me out of the way. My heart turned cold. I couldn't understand why. Was it money? Shame? Clara's influence? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing: if I stayed there, I'd die forgotten. Every part of me wanted to go home. Even if there was no home left waiting. That night, I took out the small envelope where I'd kept what little savings I had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a one-way flight back. Pilar noticed the suitcase in my hands the next morning. "You leaving?" she asked softly. I nodded. "I have to go back," I said. "My life is there." She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Then take it back." Her words stayed with me through the entire journey. The flight home felt endless. My mind raced between fear and fury. I didn't know what I'd find when I arrived. I just knew I couldn't let this be the end of my story. When the plane landed, I stepped off with nothing but a worn suitcase, Ruth's letters, and a heart full of pain. The air smelled familiar, like old memories and heartbreak. I took a bus toward my neighborhood, watching the streets change from city lights to quiet suburbs. My stomach churned as we neared my old street. I pressed my forehead against the window and whispered, "Please God, give me strength." When I finally saw my house from a distance, my breath caught. The curtains were different, the garden trimmed, and there was laughter coming from inside. My laughter once filled that house. My love once lived there. Now it belonged to someone else. That night, I made a silent vow I would return, and he would see what it feels like to be forgotten. I came back home quietly, without telling a soul, not even Ruth. I didn't want anyone to warn Daniel or Clara that I was coming. I wanted to see with my own eyes what they had done. My heart raced as the taxi turned onto my old street. Everything looked painfully familiar. The same cracked sidewalks, the same maple tree outside my house, the same porch light I had replaced 100 times. But the moment I saw my house fully, I knew it wasn't mine anymore. The curtains were new, white, and sheer instead of the floral ones I had sewn years ago. The flower beds I used to tend so lovingly were trimmed and perfect, like something out of a magazine. My garden gnome, the one Daniel made in art class when he was 8, was gone. It was like erasing proof I had ever lived there. I asked the driver to stop a few houses before mine. I didn't want anyone recognizing me just yet. It was late evening, and the lights inside the house glowed softly. Through the front window, I could see Daniel sitting at the dinner table with Clara. They looked happy. They were drinking wine, laughing. Clara leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. And he smiled a smile that didn't belong to the boy I raised. It belonged to a man who had forgotten who he was. My heart clenched, but I stayed hidden in the shadows. I watched them for a long time, my hands shaking. My son had replaced me not just in his life, but in his heart. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to storm in. I wanted to, desperately. I wanted to burst through that door, demand answers, and take back everything that was mine. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was pain, or maybe it was the realization that I didn't even know the person sitting at that table anymore. I waited until they went to bed, then walked slowly up the path. I touched the mailbox. My name was gone. In its place was a small silver plate engraved with Daniel and Clara Hale. My knees nearly buckled. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at that name, letting the betrayal sink deep into my bones. The neighbors' lights flicked off one by one until the whole street was quiet. Only my house, their house, now stood there, glowing faintly under the porch light I once replaced with my own hands. I didn't knock. I didn't cry. I just stood there in silence, my fingers brushing the doorframe that used to feel like home. Memories flooded back: Daniel running to me after school, me baking cookies while he did his homework at that same table, laughter echoing through the hallways. All of it was gone. I walked around to the side window and peered inside again. Clara had changed everything: the furniture, the pictures, even the paint. It was as if she wanted to scrub every trace of me away. I saw a family photo on the wall. Daniel and Clara, arms around each other, smiling in front of my house. My heart cracked like glass. I couldn't breathe. I turned and stumbled away, holding onto the fence for balance. My legs felt weak, my stomach heavy with nausea and disbelief. I found an old park bench nearby and sat there until dawn. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared at the house as the sky turned pink, realizing that I had become a ghost haunting my own life. When the morning came, I went to Ruth's door. She opened it slowly, and when she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "Lillian," she whispered. "You're back." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She hugged me hard, trembling. I tried to tell people, she said, but Daniel made it sound like you were happy where you were. He lied, I managed to whisper. He took everything. She led me inside, poured me tea, and listened as I told her everything: how he sent me away, how he stopped answering, how I discovered what he'd done. Ruth's face hardened. That woman changed him, she said bitterly. Since they moved in, he's been different. Cold, distant. I don't care who changed him, I said softly. He still made the choice. That night, I walked back toward my house once more, watching from the shadows like a stranger. When Clara stepped outside to take out the trash, my heart skipped. I froze, afraid she'd see me. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked in my direction, scanning the darkness. I held my breath until she turned and went back inside. My pulse hammered in my ears. It was strange, the way fear mixed with fury inside me. I wasn't just heartbroken anymore. I was angry, deeply, dangerously angry. I thought of all the years I worked for Daniel's future, of every tear I shed when he ignored my calls, of how I had built a life for him brick by brick, only for him to tear mine down. That night, as I stood in the shadows watching them live inside my stolen home, I made a decision. Not out of hatred, but out of justice. They wanted me gone. They wanted my name erased. But I wasn't done. Not yet. That's when I decided, if they wanted me erased, I'd make sure my return would haunt them forever. Revenge wasn't something I ever imagined myself capable of, but betrayal changes you. I moved into a tiny room 2 streets away from my house and pretended to be a traveler who liked silence and small breakfasts. It felt obscene, living so close yet having to hide like a thief. But I told myself it was temporary, a tactical retreat. Ruth brought me casseroles and my favorite tea, and each time she left, she'd squeeze my hand and say, "Be careful, Lillian." Her eyes held more fire than fear, and that steadied me more than I expected. I kept my movements small and careful. I learned Daniel and Clara's routines by watching from a distance. The way Daniel left at 8 in a rush on weekdays. How Clara tended the garden every Saturday morning with an attention that irritated me. The nights they hosted friends and laughed too loud. I memorized their comings and goings like a map. Money was tight, but Ruth slipped me envelopes with small sums, and an old neighbor lent me a camera she never used. I photographed mailboxes, utility meters, and the new lock on my back gate. I learned how to read property records at the municipal office, long rows of files, dusty ledgers, and the indifferent clerk who only asked for a name before handing me copies. That was when I first saw my name replaced on paper, the deed, altered, recorded under Daniel's name. My stomach turned to stone. I didn't understand all the legal jargon, so I sought someone who did. Nadia was an old friend from the courthouse, quiet, precise, with a propensity for straight talk. She owed me favors, and when I told her everything, she didn't flinch. "We'll need originals," she said. "And evidence of coercion or forgery." She drew up a short plan: gather correspondence, bank statements, any witnesses who'd seen Daniel sign documents, and most importantly, anything that tied Clara to the paperwork. For weeks, we worked in secret. Nadia dug through public records during her lunch breaks and sent me redacted copies. Ruth questioned neighbors and collected whispered testimonies how Daniel had suddenly started dressing nicer, the strange deliveries Clara received late at night. I kept my head down and my eyes open. I learned how to listen for things people didn't intend me to hear. I befriended the garbage collectors on my street with small bags of coffee, and, over time, they stopped blinking when I crouched by the bins at dawn. From them I learned that people throw away truths more readily than they discard. Leftovers. I started keeping a small notebook where I wrote names, dates, and tiny crucial details. A delivery receipt here, a car registration there. It felt ridiculous at first, an old woman playing detective, but every line was a stitch in the net I was weaving. I found out Daniel had transferred funds, signed forms, and changed the mailbox registration. The more I learned, the colder my anger became. Cold anger thinks clearly. I didn't lash out or shout. I planned. I wanted Daniel to look at the proof and feel it not as some abstract legal threat but as the weight of what he'd done to the woman who raised him. Sometimes I caught myself watching him from across the street, noticing the hollow look under his eyes when he thought no one saw. He'd sit on the porch at dusk, fingers worrying at an old habit I remembered from his childhood, a nervous tic he'd had when he learned to tie his shoes. There were moments I almost went to him then, arms open and trembling, wanting to gather him up and fix what had broken. But vengeance is patient, so was I. As the case built, I staged smaller moves to unsettle them. I slipped anonymous letters under their door notes referencing small, private things only someone close would know. A joke Daniel made at my kitchen table years ago, the nickname he called his stuffed bear. I never signed them. The letters did something different than I expected. They didn't anger Daniel as much as make him uneasy. He began checking locks more often, glancing over his shoulder. Clara, who had been unshakable, started to snap at minor inconveniences. I watched their relationship fray in the quiet way of a rope left in sun and rain, small fibers giving, unnoticed at first, then more. Nadia arranged for me to consult a handwriting expert anonymously. The expert said the signatures on the deed appeared traced. There were hesitations and tremors in strokes that didn't match my natural hand. It was proof, fragile but real. Ruth coaxed confessions out of a neighbor's teenage son, who'd been paid to help move furniture the night I was supposedly gone. He remembered seeing my old photo albums in boxes labeled for charity, not trash. Each tiny admission added to the pile until it felt like an avalanche. I started to imagine a courtroom, people in suits, a judge's gavel, Daniel hearing words he could not unsay. But I also knew the law is slow, and Clara was dangerous in ways I could not yet prove. She had friends and sharp edges. So while Nadia filed papers and prepared affidavits, I focused on one more practical thing: finding a document that would tie Clara directly to the deception. I trailed deliveries, read envelopes, and watched as Clara chatted with a courier outside a cafe. My hands shook with a mixture of fear and purpose, and I smiled inwardly at how alive it felt to be purposeful again. I had unearthed enough to make legal trouble bite, but I still needed that final, undeniable thread. And then, I found something in their trash that would become the key to everything. It was a crumpled document, a letter Daniel never meant anyone to see. I found it by chance, crouched behind a hedgerow at dawn while the street was still waking, my breath fogging the air. The garbage collectors had grown used to my odd presence. They no longer startled when I hovered near the bins with a thermos of coffee as barter. That morning, a plastic bag had split open and a corner of paper jolted free like a white flag. I fished it out with fingers numb from cold and unfolded it with a trembling that had nothing to do with the chill. The paper was stained, the ink smeared in places, but the words were legible enough to make my blood run cold. It was a letter from a man named Marco, Clara's ex-husband, demanding repayment for the deal and threatening to go public if his money wasn't returned. The letter mentioned dates and sums, a ledger entry, and a thinly veiled warning that truths are easier to sell than secrets. My hands clenched around the page as if it were a lifeline. Everything snapped into place with a clarity that made my head swim. The late-night deliveries, the whispered phone calls, the way Clara had always seemed to flinch when certain names came up. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner and furious that my son had fallen so easily into someone else's scheme. I made a copy of the letter at a small kiosk 2 blocks away, paying a boy there with the last of the change Ruth had slipped me. I carefully smoothed the page and tucked the copy into an envelope, then walked back to the house and slid it beneath the front door in the dark of night without a word. I didn't sign it. I wanted the paper to act like a seed plant, doubt between them and watch it grow. For 2 days I listened from the shadows, keen for any sign the letter had done its work. On the 3rd night, I heard it, shouting through the thin walls that carried sound like a bell. Clara's voice, sharp and high, cut through the hush, Daniel answering in a tone I didn't recognize, raw and small. Plates smashed. I pressed my face to the window and watched through the slats as Clara stormed out, hair wrapped in a scarf, a suitcase swinging from her hand. She didn't so much walk as explode down the walk, a comet of fury and hurt, and then she was gone. Daniel stood in the doorway, shoulders hunched, hands covering his face, the kind of collapse that pulls something out of you thought was steady. He wasn't just scared, he was dismantled. Neighbors came to their windows, murmuring, but no one intervened. I wanted to run to him then, to fling myself into his arms and demand to know why he had let this happen, why he had let her make him into someone who could erase his mother. But something else settled over me, an icy, clear satisfaction that the doubt I had planted had taken root. Later that night, Daniel stumbled down the steps, phone in hand, eyes hollow, and sat on the porch like someone who had been waiting for judgment. I watched as he replayed messages, the screen a small battlefield of words I could not read from where I stood. He called a number, then hung up, then called again. I imagined the letter in his pocket like a splinter under his skin, something that would ache until it was pulled out. In the days that followed, the house changed. Where there had been laughter, there were slammed doors, furtive trips to the bank, hushed conversations on the sidewalk. Clara's absence didn't bring relief. If anything, it exposed how fragile their alliance had been. I learned from Ruth that Marco had sent another message, this time more menacing, proof of transactions, screenshots, and a thin blackmail note demanding immediate settlement or exposure. It was exactly the lever I needed. I could have taken the letter straight to the police, but the law moves like molasses and I needed movement now. Movement that would make Daniel feel the betrayal the way I had. So I used the letter to pry and to poke, letting it work on them like salt on a wound. I left small, careful breadcrumbs. An anonymous tip to a coworker at Daniel's office. A whispered word to a neighbor with a gossiping streak. A photocopy slipped into a mailbox where Clara had once collected charity forms. The effect surprised me. Almost immediately, I began to see cracks appear where I had only thought I saw seams. Daniel grew paranoid. He checked locks 3 times before bed and flinched at every knock. Clara, who had once been composed and cruel, started leaving the house in the middle of the night and returning with her face streaked from crying. I felt no joy in their unraveling, only the pure, sharp clarity of a wrong being answered. But the letter in my pocket was only the beginning. It revealed manipulation and hinted at blackmail, but it also suggested something darker, that Daniel hadn't just been a willing participant, he'd been groomed, misled by promises of quick money and the illusion of success. I didn't know whether to pity him for being deceived or to loathe him for his choices. I spent many evenings staring at his boyhood photo, watching the shadow of the man he'd become overtake the smile I remembered. I knew then that I had more work to do, to pull at the threads Clara had used to bind him, to unravel the lies one by one so the full truth could be seen, not just by the police but by Daniel himself. But my heart didn't soften because I knew the truth was only beginning to surface. I learned that Clara had a long history of conning men for money and property. It started with whispers, little pieces of gossip Ruth picked up at the market, Nadia found in records, and even fragments of stories from social media that matched Clara's description. A woman with different names, always glamorous, always vanishing after money went missing. At first, I doubted it. Clara had seemed too precise, too polished to be careless enough to leave traces. But when Nadia dug deeper, the pieces aligned in a way that made my skin crawl. Clara had been married twice before. Both men had ended up bankrupt or in legal disputes soon after she disappeared. One of them, a small business owner from another state, had even filed charges, fraud and identity manipulation, but the case was dropped after he settled privately. Another had lost his home when documents were mysteriously altered in her favor. Clara wasn't just manipulative, she was professional at it. The kind of predator who wore designer perfume and smiled while she destroyed people's lives. Nadia's face turned grim as she laid out the evidence on her desk, copies of records, screenshots, old photos. "She's been doing this for years," she said quietly. "Your son isn't her first. But he might be her last if we play this right." I stared at the papers, every line of ink feeling like a fresh betrayal. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me, he had been used. But sympathy didn't come easily. He had let her. He had chosen her lies over my truth. And now, both of them were tangled in consequences neither could escape. Ruth and I spent evenings in her kitchen, planning carefully. She had an old tape recorder, the kind with the red record button. We hid it in her handbag and decided she'd bump into Clara outside the house, pretending to be friendly, hoping to catch her off guard. "If she thinks you still believe her lies," I told Ruth, "she'll talk." And she did. Clara was arrogant, confident in her ability to manipulate anyone. When Ruth mentioned hearing that I was staying abroad permanently, Clara smirked and said, "Yes, poor woman, she's happier there. Daniel and I are taking care of everything here." Ruth kept her voice even, asking about the house, about the paperwork. That's when Clara slipped, mentioning without realizing how she handled the signature issue. "Daniel couldn't even copy it right," she said with a laugh. "I had to fix it myself." My stomach twisted when I heard the recording. The evidence was perfect. Her tone, her words, her confidence, it was all there. I sent a copy to Nadia immediately. "This is what we needed," she said. "This ties her directly to the forgery." But we weren't done. I wanted Daniel to see it too, to hear her words and understand the depth of her deceit. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Daniel had begun drinking heavily, and one night, Ruth spotted him sitting alone at the local bar. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and hollowed. I waited until he stumbled home and approached quietly from the darkness. My voice trembled, but I forced it out. "Daniel." He froze, turning slowly. His eyes widened like he'd seen a ghost. "Mom?" he whispered. I didn't move closer. "We need to talk," I said simply, then handed him a small envelope. "When you sober, read up, listen to what's inside." He opened his mouth to speak, but I was already walking away. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities. Would he believe it? Would he even care? The next day, Ruth called to tell me she'd seen him pacing outside the house, holding the recorder in one hand, shouting Clara's name. I hurried to the corner of the street and hid behind the hedge, just close enough to see without being seen. Clara stood on the porch, defensive, arms crossed, denying everything. But Daniel wasn't listening. "You forged her signature," he yelled. "You lied to me." His voice cracked, raw and desperate. "You said my mother wanted to stay overseas. You made me think." Clara slapped him, sharp and hard, cutting off his words. He staggered back, stunned. The moment hung in the air like broken glass. Then she hissed something I couldn't hear and stormed inside, slamming the door. Daniel sank onto the porch steps, his face buried in his hands. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, but I stayed hidden. He needed to face this pain, the same pain he'd caused me. Days later, Clara was gone again. Her car disappeared from the driveway, her clothes from the closet. Ruth said she'd seen her at the train station, looking frantic, arguing on the phone. I didn't chase her. The law would find her eventually. What mattered was what she left behind: a trail of fraud, deception, and a broken man sitting in my house. Daniel tried to clean up her mess, but it was too late. Letters came from the bank, from debt collectors, from people I didn't even know existed. I watched from the shadows as he tried to hold it together. He looked thinner, older. The shine of his new life was gone. For the first time, I saw the boy again, the one who used to run to me when he was scared. I didn't forgive him yet, but a small piece of my anger began to shift into something else. I wanted him to know the full truth. Not just pieces, I wanted him to understand exactly how deep Clara's deception went. But before I could, someone else came looking for him, someone dangerous. It started with a knock on the door that echoed through the whole street. I was watching from across the road, sitting low behind Ruth's fence, when it happened. The sound wasn't just loud, it carried weight. A kind of authority that made even the dogs stop barking. Two men stood at the front steps, tall and dressed in dark suits that didn't belong in our quiet neighborhood. One of them carried a folder, the other leaned casually against the post, like he'd done this 1,000 times. The taller one banged on the door again. "Daniel Hale." His voice was deep and hard. "You have outstanding debts. We need to talk." The words felt like thunder rolling through my chest. Debt? My Daniel? He'd never mentioned owing anyone anything. I watched as Daniel opened the door, face pale and drawn. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose. "There must be some mistake," he said quickly, glancing over his shoulder, maybe hoping Clara would appear and fix it. But she was long gone. The men exchanged looks. "There's no mistake, Mr. Hale. You've got 30 days to settle the balance. After that, we escalate." Daniel tried to reason with them. his voice trembling. Clara handled all that, he said. She said she was taking care of it. The man's expression didn't change. Then maybe she should have stayed. But the debt's in your name. I could see Daniel's hands shaking as he signed something they handed him. They left as abruptly as they came, the echo of their shoes fading down the street. Daniel closed the door slowly, as if afraid the house might collapse if he moved too fast. I stayed hidden, my heart racing. Ruth came up behind me quietly, whispering, "Who are they?" "Collectors," I said. "Clara's past has come knocking." Over the next week, the men came back twice more each time, more forceful, less patient. The second time, they pounded until Daniel opened, half asleep and terrified. The third time, they left a red notice taped to the door. "Final warning." The neighbors started whispering. Ruth told me people were beginning to wonder what had happened to Daniel's perfect life. I felt a cruel, guilty satisfaction. The world was finally seeing the cracks he had tried to hide. But the truth was heavier than I imagined. The letter I'd found from Marco suddenly made perfect sense. Clara had used Daniel's name to borrow money, large sums, and disappeared before paying it back. He'd signed the paperwork, trusting her. She had ruined him completely. And now, the past he helped create was devouring him piece by piece. I wanted to hate him, but when I saw the fear in his eyes, I saw my little boy again. The one who used to wake me in the night after a nightmare, whispering, "Mom, don't let the monsters get me." Except this time, he had invited the monsters himself. One afternoon, I saw him sitting on the porch steps, staring blankly at the red notice in his hands. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. I wanted to walk over and tell him everything, to tell him I'd found the letter, that I was there, that I hadn't stopped loving him despite it all. But I couldn't, not yet. He needed to feel the weight of his actions before I gave him the relief of forgiveness. Ruth, ever the brave one, offered to, accidentally, bump into him. She brought him a bag of muffins and tried to start a conversation. He was polite but distant, barely meeting her eyes. "Is your mother still overseas?" she asked softly. He froze. "Yes," he lied. "She's happy there." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" He didn't answer. That night, I saw him drinking alone on the porch. The bottle clinked against the steps, his movements sluggish, defeated. The next day, the collectors came again, this time early, when the sun had barely risen. I stood at my window and watched as Daniel opened the door in his robe, looking 10 years older. "You think we're playing games?" one of them shouted. "You pay, or we take this to the next level." Daniel tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I don't have it," he said. "Please, just give me time." The man stepped closer, jabbing a finger into his chest. "Time's up." I gripped the edge of the curtain so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rage inside me was no longer cold, it was molten. This was Clara's doing, but Daniel was paying for it. And maybe, just maybe, this was his punishment for what he'd done to me. Later that night, I saw him collapse onto the porch, his hands covering his face. He didn't cry like a man, he cried like a boy, shaking, gasping for air. The sight broke something in me. No mother should ever want revenge enough to enjoy her child's suffering. But I couldn't reach out. Not yet. Not when justice was still unfinished. I walked closer, my steps silent, the night air cold against my skin. He looked up suddenly, sensing something, his eyes wide and searching the darkness. For a moment, I thought he saw me. The silence between us stretched thin, like a thread ready to snap. Then his shoulders dropped, and he buried his face in his hands again. I stood there watching, every memory, every betrayal, every tear colliding inside me. The moment he fell to his knees in front of my old porch, sobbing, I knew it was time. He didn't recognize me at first when I stepped out of the shadows. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by Daniel's uneven breathing as he knelt on the porch. The street lamp flickered weakly, painting him in alternating shades of light and darkness. My footsteps on the pavement sounded louder than I intended, and he turned sharply, startled. His eyes met mine, confusion clouding them. He blinked, frowning as though trying to connect a stang face from memory. Mom? The word left his mouth as more of a question than a statement. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, letting him look at me. I knew what he saw, someone older, thinner, with lines of exhaustion carved deep into her face. Months of loneliness and survival had changed me. I wasn't the soft mother who kissed his forehead when he was sick. I was something harder now. It's me, I said finally. You didn't think I'd stay gone forever, did you? His face went pale. He took a step toward me, then stopped, shame tightening his features. I thought you wanted to stay there. He stammered. Clara said. I interrupted, my voice sharp as glass. Clara said a lot of things, didn't she? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The weight of the truth hung between us. I walked past him, my fingers brushing the railing of the porch as I climbed the steps. My old porch. The same boards I once painted while Daniel handed me nails. My key, the one I had hidden years ago under the loose stone by the door, still fit perfectly. The lock clicked open. I stepped inside without asking permission. The smell hit me first, lavender air freshener, cheap and artificial, nothing like the scent of vanilla candles I used to light. The walls were a pale gray now. The pictures all gone. My pictures. Our memories. Replaced by Clara's taste. Sterile, expensive, soulless. Daniel stood in the doorway, silent, watching me like a man waiting for his verdict. I moved slowly through each room. The living room, where we once built blanket forts. The kitchen, where I taught him to make pancakes. The small marks on the doorframe where I'd measured his height every year they were painted over. Gone. I traced the spot with my fingers, feeling an ache so deep it almost took my breath away. Why, Daniel? I whispered. Why did you do this? He flinched. I thought I was helping, he said, quietly. Clara said you needed time. She said you wanted to start over. Start over? I laughed bitterly. By erasing me? His shoulders sagged. I didn't know she'd go this far, I swear, Mom. I didn't know about the papers, the house. But you signed them, I said. You signed my name. His eyes filled with tears. She said it was temporary. She said it would help with the bank loan just until we... He stopped, realizing how hollow his excuses sounded. I turned to face him fully. You believed a stranger over your own mother, I said. You left me thousands of miles away without a word. You let me think I was unwanted. He shook his head, tears spilling now. I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did, I said softly. You hurt me in ways you'll never understand. He tried to step closer, but I raised my hand to stop him. My anger wasn't loud, it was quiet, focused, sharp. Do you know what it's like, I said, to wake up in a place where no one knows your name? To beg for work just to eat, while your son lives in your house pretending you're dead? He lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I wanted to fix it, he whispered. I was going to. You can't fix what you destroyed with silence. My voice trembled now, the first crack in my composure. You took everything I built, Daniel, everything I was. For what? To impress her? He didn't answer. Instead, he dropped to his knees, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Mom. I swear I am. Please, I didn't know how to stop it. I stared at him for a long moment. Somewhere inside me, the mother still wanted to reach out, to comfort him. But the woman I'd become, the one who had been left behind and humiliated, kept her arms crossed. Sorry doesn't give me back the years you stole, I said. It doesn't bring back the home you took. I turned and walked to the window, staring out at the yard. The maple tree still stood there, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. The same tree under which Daniel once buried his childhood time capsule. He'd written, Mom, I'll always come back. The irony was unbearable. I looked at him again, broken, remorseful, terrified. You took everything from me, Daniel, I said slowly. Now watch how I take it back. He looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? You'll find out, I said coldly. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I dialed Nadia's number. When she answered, I said only 4 words. It's time. File everything. Daniel's face drained of color. Mom, what are you doing? What you taught me, I said. Surviving. He tried to apologize, but I was already dialing the lawyer's number. Justice has its own rhythm. It may be slow, but it's relentless. The morning after our confrontation, I woke before dawn. My hands were trembling, not from fear but from the momentum of everything that was finally unfolding. For months, I had gathered pieces of truth, fragments of deception, and now they were forming a picture the world could no longer ignore. Nadia met me at the small cafe near the courthouse. She was calm as always, sipping black coffee while I sat across from her clutching the folder we'd built together. Inside were copies of forged documents, voice recordings, and the letter from Clara's ex-husband. This is more than enough, she said. The house, the fraud, the forged signature, it's airtight. They'll have no choice but to investigate. I nodded, but my stomach churned. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I wanted justice, real, undeniable justice. Daniel had taken my home, but Clara had stolen far more than property. She had taken my son's soul and twisted it until I barely recognized him. Nadia filed everything that morning. She moved with precision, her fingers tapping across the forms with quiet authority. By noon, the wheels were in motion officially. A fraud case was opened. Clara's name was listed alongside Daniel's, though I asked Nadia to push for leniency for him if possible. He was manipulated, I said softly. But he still has to face what he did. She nodded. The truth will do the punishing for you. The following days were a blur of questions, signatures, and court visits. I sat through interviews with investigators, reliving every painful detail. The forged documents, the abandonment, the false transfer of ownership. Each word I spoke cut deeper, but I didn't stop. Daniel was summoned soon after. Ruth saw him leave the house early one morning, suit rumpled, eyes hollow. He went in defiant but came out shattered. He called me that evening, his voice small and hesitant. They told me everything's being investigated, he said. Mom, please. You didn't have to do this. Didn't I? I asked quietly. You took my life, Daniel. I'm just taking it back. He didn't reply. For a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard in years. He was crying. I don't know who I am anymore, he whispered. Good, I said. Maybe now you can find out. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Clara, realizing the net was closing, fled the city. Nadia's contacts traced her through bank transactions, and within weeks, she was found in another state under a different name. She was arrested quietly, without drama, though the newspapers soon picked up the story. Local woman implicated in multi-state fraud ring. I read the headline and felt no joy, only relief. The storm I'd summoned had arrived, and it didn't discriminate. Daniel's name appeared in the reports too, though always as a cooperating witness. I knew Nadia had done that for me. Still, the consequences came fast. He lost his job within days, his reputation tarnished. Neighbors stopped speaking to him, whispers following him wherever he went. And yet, I didn't gloat. I didn't even visit the house. I rented a small apartment nearby and focused on the process. It was my turn to live in peace while he learned to live with guilt. Weeks passed before the court hearing. When the day came, I sat in the front row, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead, shoulders slumped, his lawyer whispering in his ear. He didn't turn to look at me once. Clara, escorted in by officers, still managed to hold her chin high. Even in defeat, she tried to look powerful. But her eyes flickered when she saw me. For a moment, I saw the mask crack. The prosecutor laid out everything: documents, recordings, witnesses. Clara's smirk disappeared entirely when Ruth's recording was played in court. Her voice filled the room. Daniel couldn't even copy it right. I had to fix it myself. The judge's expression hardened. The rest unfolded like clockwork. The verdict came swiftly. Clara was found guilty of fraud and forgery. Daniel's involvement was deemed negligent but not criminal, as evidence showed she had manipulated him and forged parts of his signature as well. My house, my property, and my name were fully restored. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courtroom like thunder. The moment it ended, I didn't move. I sat there for a long while, staring at my hands, realizing I'd won, but the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. When I finally stood, Daniel was waiting outside. He didn't speak, just looked at me with eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "You should be," I replied. "But that's between you and God now." I turned and walked out into the sunlight. For the first time in years, the air felt clean, sharp, real. Ruth met me at the steps, hugging me tight. "It's over," she said. "No," I murmured. "It's just different now." When the verdict came in my favor, I didn't celebrate. I simply walked out into the sunlight, free at last. When the dust settled, Daniel showed up at my door, barefoot and broken. It was a gray morning, the kind that carried the weight of something unfinished. I was sitting by the window in my small apartment, sipping tea, when I heard the soft knock. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. No one visited me unannounced anymore. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his clothes wrinkled and damp. He looked smaller somehow, not in size but in spirit. "Mom," he said quietly. The words sounded different now, fragile, stripped of the arrogance it once carried. I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. He stood awkwardly by the door, glancing around at my modest furniture. The worn rug, the smell of freshly brewed tea. "You shouldn't have come," I said softly. He swallowed hard. "I had to." He sat down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was no longer filled with anger, it was heavy with something else, regret. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. His voice cracked. "I was blind. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you from yourself." Clara made it sound so simple. I didn't realize what I was losing until it was too late. I looked at him, at the lines of guilt etched across his face, and for the first time, I saw not a villain, but a lost child trapped in the shell of a man. "You believed lies because they were easier than truth," I said. "You chose comfort over conscience." "I know." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," I said. "You don't." He looked down, the words hitting him like a blow. I sighed and softened my tone. "But maybe forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. Maybe it's about who needs it." He raised his eyes slowly, hope flickering like a dying flame. "Do you?" I nodded. "I need peace. I've spent too many nights hating you, Daniel. It's eaten pieces of me I can't get back." He reached across the table, but I didn't take his hand. "You can't fix this with words," I said. "If you mean it, show me. Prove it." He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "I will." He started coming by every morning with groceries, eggs, milk, fresh bread. He offered to repair the things that had broken in my home: the leaky faucet, the loose cabinet door, the window latch that had stuck for years. He worked quietly, without complaint. Sometimes we'd talk. Other times, we just existed side by side in silence. The kind of silence that feels almost sacred. Ruth stopped by one afternoon and found him fixing the fence outside. She raised her eyebrows and whispered to me, "You really think he's changed?" I looked at him. His back bent, his hands steady. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm willing to see." There were moments when the old wounds resurfaced. When I'd catch him looking at me with guilt, I'd feel the old anger stir inside. But then I'd remember how it felt to stand outside my own house, watching him live a life that wasn't his to take. I wasn't ready to forget, but I was learning to live again without drowning in bitterness. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel knocked again. This time, he held a small envelope. "I've been saving," he said. "I want to help you fix the house." I hesitated. The house is mine again, I said. It doesn't need fixing. Maybe not the house, he said softly. Maybe us. I didn't know how to respond, so I opened the envelope. Inside was a check, not much, but I could tell it was nearly everything he had left. You don't have to. I do, he interrupted. I need to start giving back. I placed the envelope on the table. Keep it, I said. Money can't buy what was lost. But if you want to help me, then start with honesty. He nodded, looking away, his jaw tightening. I'll earn it, Mom. I promise. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was something. One morning, a letter arrived addressed to me in delicate handwriting. No return address. I recognized the loops and flourishes instantly, Clara's handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened it. The paper trembled in my hands as I read the first line. Lillian, I owe you the truth. She confessed everything, how she had targeted Daniel, how she'd planned every step, and how she envied me for the love Daniel once had for me. She wrote, You were never supposed to stay gone. I just wanted what you had, his loyalty. But I never understood that loyalty can't be stolen. The letter ended with a strange line. He still loves you. He always did, even when he didn't know how to show it. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside Daniel's old photo. When he came by later that day, I didn't tell him about it. Some truths didn't need to be spoken yet. We sat outside as the evening air turned cool. The quiet between us soft now instead of sharp. For the first time in years, I felt the smallest flicker of peace. And then, one morning, a letter arrived from Clara, confessing everything. Clara's letter was the final piece of the puzzle I never knew I needed. When I first read it, I thought it was another trick, some new way to twist the knife. But as I went through the pages, line by trembling line, I realized it wasn't manipulation. It was surrender. The letter was handwritten on thin paper, the kind that crumples easily. But her words carried a strange weight. She wrote about the games she'd played, the lies she'd told, and the people she'd ruined. I've always been good at pretending, she confessed. Pretending to love, pretending to care, pretending to be the kind of woman men build their futures around. There was no elegance in her words, just guilt. She admitted to forging my signature, to convincing Daniel that I wanted to stay away, to transferring the deed to his name. I told him it was legal, that it was just paperwork, she wrote. He believed me because he wanted to. He was so eager to prove himself worthy of me that he never stopped to ask if he should. I could almost hear her voice as I read. That cool, practiced tone she used when lying, now stripped bare. She wrote that she'd grown up poor, always reaching for what wasn't hers, and that by the time she met Daniel, she had stopped seeing people as human beings, only as ladders to climb. But her last words stunned me. You were supposed to stay gone, Lillian, she wrote. But even after all I did, he still talked about you. Even when I told him you'd forgotten him, he still looked sad when he saw mothers with their children. That's when I realized I could take everything from you but not his love for you. I sat there for a long time, the letter shaking in my hands. I wasn't sure what to feel. Pity? Anger? Relief? Clara had destroyed my life, but in her confession, she'd handed me something unexpected. The truth Daniel had been too blind to see. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into my bag. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave me a strange sense of closure. She'd admitted her sins in writing. That was something I could live with. That afternoon, Daniel came by as usual, carrying groceries and a nervous smile. He had grown quieter over the past few weeks, almost reverent in how he treated me. There was no arrogance left, only humility. I motioned for him to sit. I received something today, I said. His brow furrowed. From who? I slid the letter across the table. Clara. His eyes widened. He hesitated before unfolding it, his hands trembling. As he read, his face drained of color. The silence stretched as he turned each page, his lips tightening, his jaw trembling. By the time he finished, tears had begun to gather in his eyes. She admitted everything, he whispered. All of it. Yes. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the weight of the words was pressing down on him. Mom, I'm so sorry, he said again, his voice cracking. You trusted me. And I let her turn me into something I'm not. I let her make me believe you didn't care. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking. I raised you to think for yourself, Daniel. She didn't make you choose her over me, you did that on your own. He nodded slowly, shame written across his face. I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. Making up for it isn't about what you do for me, I said gently. It's about who you become after this. We sat in silence for a long while, the letter lying between us like a ghost of everything that had happened. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. It reminded me of the day Daniel was born, the same gray light, the same heavy air full of both fear and hope. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. He flinched slightly, then relaxed, his fingers curling around mine. You're still my son, I said quietly. And I still love you. But love doesn't erase consequences, it just makes them bearable. His tears fell freely now, and for the first time, I let mine fall too. Years of anger and grief poured out between us in silence, washing away the bitterness that had poisoned us both. Later that evening, we went to the house, the real one, my house. The air smelled of fresh paint and soil. Daniel had been fixing it up quietly in the weeks since the verdict. The yard was neat again. And in the corner, near the maple tree, a small hole had been dug. He handed me a sapling. I thought maybe we could plant this, he said, for a new start. I nodded, unable to speak. Together, we lowered the tree into the earth. As we filled the hole, I thought about everything buried there with its lies, pain, betrayal, but also forgiveness. The first green leaf fluttered gently in the breeze, and for the first time in years, I felt something light stir inside me. Do you think things will ever be the same? Daniel asked. I shook my head. No, I said softly. But maybe they can be better. But even as we rebuilt, I knew trust could never grow back the same way. Today I sit on my porch, sipping tea, watching the sunrise over the home that's truly mine again. The morning light touches everything it once belonged to: my garden, my chipped fence, even the old rocking chair that creaks like it's sighing in relief. The house smells faintly of lavender and soap, the kind of scent that means peace, not pretense. For the first time in years, there's no tension in the air, no ghosts waiting in the corners. It's just me. Me. And a life I rebuilt from ashes. Daniel visits often now. He always knocks, never walks in without asking, as if he's afraid to cross a line that can't be crossed again. Sometimes he brings groceries, sometimes tools, sometimes just himself. He's quiet, gentler. I can tell the guilt still lingers in him, sitting heavy like an unhealed bruise. But there's something else now too, a kind of humility I never thought I'd see in him again. One afternoon, while he was fixing the fence, I brought him lemonade. He looked up at me with a small smile, the kind I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. You used to make this for me after soccer practice, he said. You always said it helped with the heat. I remember, I said softly. He took a sip, then looked down at his hands. You were right about everything, Mom. About Clara. I thought I was building a better life, but all I was doing was running from who I was. I sat beside him on the steps. It's never too late to stop running, I said. He nodded slowly. I'm trying. He's kept his word. He found a modest job in town, nothing glamorous but honest work. I can see the pride in his eyes when he talks about earning his own way again. Every paycheck, he brings a small envelope and places it on the kitchen counter. For the house, he says. Though I never ask him for a thing. I keep those envelopes in a drawer, unopened. They're not about money. They're about repentance. We've built new traditions, quiet ones. Sunday dinners where we talk about small things, the weather, the garden, the neighbors. Sometimes we fall silent, the weight of the past hovering between us. But neither of us runs from it anymore. We let it be what it is, a scar, not a wound. The garden, once wild and overgrown, has come back to life. The roses I planted years ago bloom again, their colors brighter than I remember. Maybe that's just how healing looks, familiar things appearing new. I spend most mornings tending the soil, humming old songs, feeling the dirt under my nails. Each time I water the plants, I think about the version of myself who once stood on foreign soil, scared and forgotten. I wish I could tell her that she'd make it home. That she'd survive the loneliness, the betrayal, the loss, and still find something worth living for. Some nights, when the air is warm and the crickets sing, Daniel joins me on the porch. We don't talk much. He sits beside me, his hands clasped together, and I know he's still trying to make sense of everything. I think we both are. Do you ever miss her? I asked once, quietly. He hesitated, then shook his head. I miss who I thought she was, he said. But I think that's what I've been doing most of my life, missing people who never really existed. I understood that too well. We both lost something to Clara, but maybe she'd also given us something. Back, the brutal truth we'd both avoided for years. I no longer measure my life by what I lost. Instead, I count what remains. Ruth still visits, her laughter filling the house like it used to. She calls me the toughest woman in town. Though I tell her I'm just stubborn. Nadia drops by occasionally, always carrying another stack of papers. You're famous in the courthouse, she jokes. They still talk about the woman who took down a fraud ring. I laugh. But deep down, I know it's not fame that matters. It's freedom. True freedom. Freedom from fear. From silence. From being erased. One morning, Daniel arrived with a surprise. Come outside, he said. In the yard, under the maple tree, stood a small wooden bench. It was engraved with the words, "Home is where forgiveness grows." I ran my fingers over the letters, tears stinging my eyes. Did you make this? I asked. He nodded shyly. I thought we needed a reminder, he said. I couldn't speak for a long time. Finally, I whispered. You're becoming the man I always hoped you'd be. He looked at me with quiet sincerity. I'm trying, Mom, every day. Time doesn't erase the past, it simply softens the edges until the pain becomes memory instead of open wound. I still wake up some nights remembering the woman I was in that foreign country, alone and scared. But now, when I open my eyes, I see my own walls, my own roof, my own home. The light through the window feels like forgiveness. I keep Clara's letter in a small box tucked away. Not as a trophy, but as proof. Proof that even the cruelest truths can become stepping stones to strength. My life, once stolen, now feels fully mine again. I eat when I want, sleep when I please, and no longer wait for anyone's approval. I write sometimes pages of my story that I may never show to anyone. Writing helps me breathe. It reminds me that survival isn't about revenge, it's about reclamation. Each word I put on paper is another piece of myself reclaimed from the shadows. As the sun sets, I take one last look around the porch, the garden, the house glowing warm in the evening light. I've lost much, but I've gained something unbreakable, myself. And that, I realize, is enough. My life is mine again, earned through pain, reclaimed through courage. And if Daniel ever forgets that lesson again, he knows I won't.